The wind howled like a hungry wolf through the plains as Clara watched the last wagon disappear over the ridge, the dust it kicked up already settling like the silence around her. They hadn't even looked back. Her hands shook as she clutched her thin shawl closer, the frayed edges flapping like the only wings she'd ever have. Night was coming fast, and with it, the cold, the kind that cuts through skin and bone, that makes a woman forget the shape of warmth. Clara's husband had been dead for 2 months, buried under rocks by the river when the ground was too hard to dig. The wagon master had said she could stay with the caravan, had promised they wouldn't leave her behind. But promises were like autumn leaves, pretty to look at but worthless when the wind came, and tonight the wind was a beast. Clara scanned the darkening horizon, her eyes stinging with cold and tears she refused to let fall. Behind her, the prairie stretched vast and unforgiving, a sea of grass that hid more than it revealed. Ahead, nothing but emptiness. Except, wait, a flicker of light, just beyond the hill. She squinted, her breath catching. Was it another campfire? Had the caravan stopped after all? Or was it something else? Something worse? The stories came flooding back then, the tales of Lakota warriors who prowled these plains, of Comanche raiders who stole women and left their scalps to dry in the sun. But her feet moved on their own, one in front of the other, until she was running toward that light like a moth to a flame. The fire grew larger, and with it, the outline of a man sitting cross-legged by the flames, his dark hair falling over broad shoulders, his eyes closed as if in prayer. Clara skidded to a stop, her breath hitching, her chest heaving. He opened his eyes then, and they glowed like embers in the firelight. A Lakota Brave, alone, watching her like he had been expecting her all along. And in that instant, Clara's knees gave out, and the last of her strength crumbled to dust. The fire crackled between them, its glow painting the stranger's face in gold and shadow. Clara's knees dug into the cold earth, her palms trembling against the ground as she tried to catch her breath. The Lakota Brave didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, watched her with a calm that was more unsettling than any blade. Clara swallowed hard, forcing herself to sit up. I didn't know anyone was here, she said, her voice breaking. They left me behind. The words fell like stones into the silence, heavy and sharp. The man's gaze dropped to her feet, bare and bleeding from the run, then back to her face. Still he said nothing. Was he deciding whether to kill her? Take her captive? The stories she'd heard came rushing back, the raids, the missing women, the screams that echoed through the plains. But he didn't move. He just sat there, a figure carved from stone, his long dark hair falling over one shoulder, a single feather tied into the braid. Clara forced herself to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. I'll go, she said, backing away, her hands raised. I won't bother you. But the ground tilted beneath her, and the world spun in a darkening blur. The next thing she knew, his hands were under her arms, catching her before she hit the ground. He was strong. Too strong. Clara's heart hammered as he eased her down beside the fire, her back propped against a rolled-up blanket. He knelt beside her, reaching into a leather pouch. Eat, he said, his voice low and steady. It was the first word he'd spoken, and it hung in the air like a command. He handed her a piece of dried meat, his eyes watching as if testing her trust. Clara took it, her fingers shaking. Thank you, she whispered, but the words felt too small, too fragile. The man said nothing more, just returned to the fire and sat cross-legged, his gaze fixed on the flames. Clara chewed slowly, the taste of smoke and salt thick on her tongue. She wanted to ask his name, wanted to know why he hadn't killed her or sent her away. But when she finally gathered the courage to speak, he was already asleep, his back to her, a knife resting on his thigh as if daring her to try and run. Morning came with a gray mist clinging to the plains like a shroud, and Clara woke to the scent of smoke and the soft, rhythmic sound of a knife scraping against wood. She blinked against the light, her eyes adjusting to the figure seated across the fire. The Lakota Brave sat with his back to her, his broad shoulders framed by the rising sun, a wooden figure in his hand that he was carving with slow, deliberate strokes. Clara pushed herself up, her muscles aching from the cold ground. The blanket he had placed over her slid to her lap. It was his. Worn leather, smelling of earth and smoke, and heavy enough to have kept her warm through the night. He had given her warmth and asked for nothing. Clara swallowed, her throat dry. "Thank you," she said, her voice rough as gravel. The man did not turn around. He continued carving, his hands working as if they had known that rhythm for a lifetime. Are you going to stay here?" she asked, her eyes darting to the horizon. The wagon train was gone. The only footprints left were her own, leading to his campfire. Finally he spoke. "Where will you go?" His voice was calm, even, as if he already knew the answer. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the bite of the morning air through her thin dress. "I don't know." Her husband had been her compass, her anchor, and now she was adrift. No money, no food, no way to get to the next town. "Then stay," he said simply. "For now?" Clara's gaze fell to the wooden figure in his hand. It was a bird, wings outstretched, captured mid-flight. "What's your name?" she asked. He paused, the knife stilling against the wood. "Ahote," he said, eyes still on the carving. "It means restless one." The name suited him somehow, wild and untamed, like the wind that had howled through the night. "I'm Clara," she said, her voice small. Ahote didn't respond. He finished the carving and placed the wooden bird beside the fire. Then he stood, his dark eyes meeting hers for the first time. "Rest, Clara," he said. "The night is over, but you're not safe yet." And with that, he turned away, his shadow stretching long across the plains as he walked into the mist, leaving her alone with the bird and the echoes of his name. By midday, the mist had lifted, revealing the endless stretch of prairie that surrounded them like a sea of grass. Clara sat alone by the fire, the wooden bird cradled in her hands, its carved wings rough against her fingertips. Ahote was nowhere to be seen. The silence gnawed at her, every creak of grass and rustle of wind sending her heart skittering like a rabbit. She was alone again. Truly alone. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats, faint but growing louder. Clara scrambled to her feet, the bird dropping to the ground as she rushed to the rise behind the camp. From there she could see them. 4 riders, men in wide-brimmed hats and dust-covered coats, rifles slung across their backs. They were coming fast, their horses kicking up dirt like storm clouds. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears. Were they settlers? Or worse, were they the ones who had left her behind? Panic clawed at her throat. She turned to run but collided with something solid. Ahote. He had appeared like a ghost, his dark eyes locked onto the approaching riders. "Get down," he said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. Clara dropped to the ground, pressing herself against the dirt as Ahote stepped forward, his body a living wall between her and the riders. He stood tall, unarmed, hands hanging loose at his sides. The riders drew closer, and Clara caught sight of their faces. Unshaven, mean-eyed, the kind of men who took what they wanted and asked questions later. The leader, a man with a scar running from his brow to his chin, reined in his horse. "Well, well," he said, his voice as slick as oil. "What do we have here? A brave playing house with a little lost bird?" Ahote said nothing. His eyes never left the man's face. The rider's gaze slid to Clara, his lip curling. "Pretty thing," he sneered. "Maybe we'll take her off your hands." Ahote didn't move, didn't blink. And that's when Clara saw it, the knife strapped to his thigh, hidden beneath the folds of his coat. A single blade, but in his hands, it might as well have been a war drum. The rider leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "What do you say, Brave? You gonna share?" Ahote's jaw tightened, his shoulders squared. And in that instant, Clara knew that whatever happened next would decide whether she would live or die. The rider dismounted slowly, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he stalked forward, eyes fixed on Clara like a hawk eyeing prey. Clara pressed herself deeper into the ground, her breath shallow, her heart a wild, frantic beat. Ahote stood still as stone, the firelight casting his shadow long and menacing across the dirt. The other 3 riders stayed mounted, their hands resting lazily on their rifles, as if this was nothing more than sport. "Last chance, Brave," the scarred man said, his hand drifting to the hilt of the knife at his belt. "Step aside and let us take what we want." Ahote's jaw clenched. "She's not yours to take." The man laughed, the sound cold and empty, echoing across the plains. "Everything out here is ours to take." And with that, he lunged. The world seemed to slow as the man's knife slashed through the air, a gleam of silver against the sun. But Ahote was faster. His hand shot out, catching the man's wrist and twisting hard. Bone snapped like a dry branch, and the knife fell to the ground. The man howled in pain, but Ahote was already moving, a blur of muscle and fury. He drove his fist into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Dust flew up in a cloud, mingling with the man's curses. The other riders tensed, rifles lifting from their saddles. But they hesitated, eyes darting from their fallen leader to the man who had put him there. "Stay down," Ahote warned, his voice low and deadly. The scarred man spat blood, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. "You'll pay for that, savage," he snarled, clawing at the dirt, trying to rise. Ahote didn't give him the chance. He stepped forward, planting a boot against the man's chest, pinning him to the ground. "Leave," Ahote said, his voice like a growl. "Now." The man's eyes flashed with hatred, but he nodded, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Fine," he hissed, "but we'll be back." Ahote lifted his boot, and the man scrambled to his feet, staggering toward his horse. "Next time you won't be so lucky," he spat, climbing into the saddle. The riders wheeled their horses around, galloping away in a cloud of dust and curses. Clara released the breath she'd been holding, her chest heaving. Ahote turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "You're not safe here," he said. "Not anymore." They moved through the prairie like ghosts, the grass whispering around them as if sharing secrets only the land could hear. Ahote led the way, his shoulders tense, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the riders. Clara followed close behind, her feet stumbling over stones and roots, her heart still hammering from the encounter. The scent of blood and smoke lingered in her nose, the memory of the man's twisted sneer flashing every time she blinked. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small, nearly swallowed by the wind. Ahote didn't answer. He just kept moving, his jaw set, his knife still stained with the rider's blood. Clara swallowed, her mouth dry. She was used to being ignored by men, but this silence was different. It was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Ahote stopped beneath a stand of cottonwoods, the air cooler here, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. "Here," he said, dropping his satchel and pulling out a water pouch. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. Clara took it, her hands shaking as she drank. The water was cool, a balm against her dry throat. "Thank you," she said, wiping her mouth. Ahote sat down, his back against a tree, his eyes fixed on the distance. Clara sat across from him, hugging her knees to her chest. "Those men," she began, her voice trembling. "Will they come back?" Ahote's gaze flicked to her, his dark eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Yes." Clara shivered, her arms wrapping tighter around herself. "Why did you help me?" Ahote looked away, his jaw working as if he were chewing the words before spitting them out. "You were alone," he said finally. "Lost." The words stung, but Clara nodded. "And now?" "Now you're a target," Ahote said bluntly. "They saw you with me. They'll think you're with me." Clara frowned, the implication settling like a stone in her gut. "And that's a bad thing?" Ahote's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Depends on who you ask." Clara watched him, her eyes searching his face. "What are you going to do?" Ahote leaned his head back against the tree, eyes closing. "Stay. Watch. For how long?" Clara whispered. Ahote didn't open his eyes. "Until they come, or until you decide to run." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead. Clara sat there, the night closing in, and wondered which of them would break first. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that pressed down like a hand against the earth. Clara woke to the sound of hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, like a drumbeat marking time. Her eyes snapped open, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Ahote was already up, his back to her, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Clara scrambled to her feet, her breath fogging in the chill air. "Are they—" She couldn't finish the question. Ahote nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's them!" Clara's blood ran cold. The riders were coming back, and this time they weren't alone. From the rise behind them, Clara could see them. 7 riders now, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. The scarred man led them, his jaw set, a rifle slung across his back. Beside him rode a man twice as large, a brute of a man with a thick, tangled beard and eyes that gleamed with malice. "Who is he?" Clara whispered, her fists clenched. "The one with the beard?" "Carlyle," Ahote said, his voice flat and deadly. "Scar's brother." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "And he's worse?" Ahote didn't answer. He didn't have to. The riders drew closer, their horses snorting clouds of steam into the air. Clara took a step back, her heels hitting the base of a tree. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice cracking. Ahote pulled his knife from its sheath, the blade flashing in the weak light. "Stay behind me." "There are too many," Clara said, her voice shaking. "We can't—" "Stay. Behind." "Me," Ahote repeated, each word a stone dropped in a well. Clara pressed herself against the tree, her fingers digging into the bark as Ahote stepped forward to meet the riders. They reined in their horses just feet away, dust and gravel swirling around their boots. The scarred man grinned, his teeth yellow against his weathered skin. "Thought you could make a fool of me?" he said, eyes blazing as he fixed his gaze on Ahote. "You should have run when you had the chance." Carlyle dismounted, the ground shuddering beneath his boots. He cracked his knuckles, the sound like gunshots in the heavy silence. "You're dead, savage," he growled, eyes locked on Ahote. Ahote said nothing. He just widened his stance, the knife glinting in his hand, and behind him Clara's fingers dug deeper into the tree, her heart pounding as the first shot echoed across the valley. The first shot cracked through the air like a lightning strike, sending a flock of birds screeching into the gray sky. Clara pressed herself tighter against the tree, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might give her away. The riders spread out in a half circle, surrounding Ahote like wolves closing in on prey. Carlyle sneered, lowering his smoking rifle. "Still standing, huh?" Ahote's eyes remained fixed on the men, his jaw clenched, his knife gleaming like a fang. The scarred man drew his pistol, aiming it square at Ahote's chest. "This time, you're not walking away." Before Clara could scream, Ahote moved. He ducked to the left, the bullet whizzing past his ear and embedding itself in the tree behind him. Without missing a beat, he lunged forward, his knife flashing in a silver arc that caught the scarred man across the thigh. The man howled, stumbling back as blood sprayed across the dirt. Carlyle roared, charging forward, fists swinging like hammers. Ahote dropped to one knee, rolled to the side, and came up swinging. The knife plunged into Carlyle's side, but the giant only grunted, grabbing Ahote by the throat and slamming him to the ground. The impact echoed through the valley, a bone-crunching thud that sent Clara's stomach twisting. "Got you now, you savage dog," Carlyle snarled, his beefy hands tightening around Ahote's throat. Ahote's face turned red, veins bulging as he gasped for air. Clara's nails dug into the bark behind her, her mind screaming for her to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there frozen and useless. But then she saw it. The wooden bird lying in the dirt, its wings splayed open like it was ready to fly. Without thinking, she lunged forward, grabbing the bird and hurling it as hard as she could. It struck Carlyle in the back of the head with a solid crack, and he yelped, his grip on Ahote loosening just enough. Ahote twisted free, his fist flying up to connect with Carlyle's jaw. The big man staggered back, clutching his face, and Ahote scrambled to his feet, his eyes blazing. Blood dripped from his mouth, his cheek already swelling, but he stood tall, breathing hard, the knife still in his hand. The other riders hesitated, their eyes darting from their wounded leader to the man they had thought was already beaten. And Clara, chest heaving, felt the cold rush of fear turn to something else, something hotter, something that felt like hope. The silence after the fight was as sharp as a blade. Carlyle lay sprawled in the dirt, blood oozing from his split lip, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. The other riders hovered nearby, hands twitching over their holstered guns, but none dared to move. Ahote stood over Carlyle, his chest heaving, the knife glinting in his hand like a sliver of moonlight. His eyes were dark and wild, fixed on the man beneath him, as if seeing through him to something far worse. "Go ahead," Carlyle spat, blood dribbling down his chin. "Kill me. Prove everyone right." Ahote's jaw tightened, the muscles in his arm flexing as the knife hovered just above Carlyle's throat. Clara held her breath, her heart slamming against her ribs, every nerve screaming for Ahote to stop, to let it go, to be the man she knew he was. But Ahote's eyes were far away, trapped in a memory only he could see. A campfire, a family slaughtered, a brother's last breath rasping against his ear. Carlyle grinned up at him, the grin of a man who thinks he's already won. "Come on, savage. Show her what you really are." And in that moment, Clara saw it, the flicker of doubt in Ahote's eyes, the war waging inside him between the man he was and the man they wanted him to be. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her hand closing over his wrist. "Ahote," she said softly, her voice trembling. "This isn't you." His eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment it was just the two of them, the world falling away. Then Ahote exhaled, a long, shuddering breath, and dropped the knife. It hit the ground with a dull thud. Carlyle's grin faltered, his eyes widening as Ahote stepped back, his fists clenched at his sides. "Get out," Ahote said, his voice raw and shaking, "before I change my mind." The riders exchanged uneasy glances, then scrambled to pull Carlyle to his feet. They half dragged, half carried him to the horses, tossing fearful glances over their shoulders as they mounted up. "This ain't over," Carlyle snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. "We'll be back, and when we do—" "You won't," Ahote said, his voice cold as stone. "Next time, I won't let you walk away." And as the riders vanished into the distance, Clara let out a shaky breath, her knees buckling as she sank to the ground. Ahote remained standing, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his jaw tight, his fists still clenched. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled, the first warning of the storm to come. The clouds gathered heavy and dark, rolling over the plains like a wave swallowing the sky. Clara and Ahote sat beneath the cottonwoods, the air thick with the scent of rain, and the unspoken words hanging between them. Ahote's hands were raw, his knuckles bruised and bleeding. Clara wrapped them gently with strips of cloth torn from her own dress, her fingers trembling as she worked. "You didn't have to stop," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have killed him." Ahote's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the riders had disappeared. "That's what he wanted," he said, "to turn me into what they say I am." Clara swallowed, her throat tight. "What do they say you are?" "A savage," he said, the word bitter in his mouth. "A killer, a man without a soul." He pulled his hands away, the bandages tight against his skin. "If I'd done it, they'd have been right." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above them, sending a chill through Clara's bones. "But they're not right," she said, her voice firmer now. "You saved me. You saved this place. That doesn't make you a savage." Ahote met her eyes then, and for a moment the mask slipped. Clara saw the hurt there, the wounds that ran deeper than flesh, the battles he'd fought long before she'd ever known his name. "I couldn't save them all," he said, his voice breaking. "My family, my brother. I wasn't there when they came." Clara reached out, her hand resting over his. "You were here for me." Ahote's eyes closed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the past had finally crushed him. "What happens now?" Clara asked, her fingers still holding his. "Carlyle will come back, with more men, with guns." Ahote's eyes opened, dark and determined. "Then we'll be ready," he said. "We?" Clara's heart pounded. "You're staying?" Ahote nodded, his jaw set. "This land is ours now, yours and mine, and I won't run from it." Thunder cracked above them, and the first drops of rain fell, cold and sharp against their skin. But Clara didn't flinch. She leaned into Ahote's side, her cheek resting against his shoulder, her heart beating in time with his. And as the storm raged on around them, they sat together. Two souls who had been left behind, but had finally found a place to call home.